Teague wiped his forehead with his handkerchief when he finished descending the stairs. He had gotten quite adept at managing the feet in the time he had been at Oakshade. He could take the stairs nearly as well as anyone else. But this July heat was another thing. His first summer since Antietam was proving to him that he was not going to adapt to being a cripple any time soon. The heat made his stump swell and sweat, and he always had an itch there regardless of how much he tried to scratch. And the ache at the end never seemed to go away. His pills only succeeded in distracting him from it, by keeping his thoughts from complete coherence, so that he must always make an effort to think. He felt thick-headed now, 30 minutes after swallowing his 2 pills, but somehow he really didn't care. Teague tugged at his collar. The Army had at last settled its account with him last week, so he could finally pay Dr. Warner for this suit. He liked the feeling, however transient it was, that he was independent, and that may have been why he liked the suit so well. It had been almost 3 years since he'd had clothes that actually fit, and Brown agreed with him. It was better than blue. Anything was, for that matter. Teague thought for a moment about why he had come downstairs and about how lucky he was that no one was around to see him standing there aimlessly. He remembered how hot he was, and that there was a good breeze outside. Oh yes, that was the reason he had left his room. The front door stood open, and let some of the air in to tousle his hair as he went toward it. He stopped at the sound of humming just before stepping outside. The muted voice was unmistakable. Annalee was on the porch, probably finishing the embroidery on that lavender dress she had been working at every day that week. She was determined to wear it to her cousin's wedding tomorrow. Must I be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease, while others fought to win the prize and sailed through bloody seas? Teague winced a little at the slightly off-key change from humming to singing. Annalee's trouble was she sang everything half an octave higher than it needed to be. She began the second verse, and Teague cleared his throat. "Oh!" Annalee started. "You scared me." "I didn't mean to." "No, it's all right. I'm surprised I didn't hear your crutches." She caught herself at an imagined insult. "Sorry." Teague shrugged his shoulders and then sat in a chair where the sun was not shining on the porch. He'd never seen a person so self-conscious as she, except perhaps when he looked in a mirror, he amended. "How long were you standing there listening to me squawking? And don't shake your head that way. I know I can't sing, so none of that gentleman's flattery." Teague could only grin and look at the ground before meeting her gaze again. "You're not that bad." "But bad enough." "Well," Annalee laughed. "Thank you. It's a pity for other people that I like to sing. I usually try to spare them, but sometimes I can't help it. Don't you like singing, Teague?" "It depends." "On what?" "On what the song is and whether anyone can hear me." Annalee looked out to the driveway. Coretta and Aunt Clara were coming in their chase. "Right on time." She turned to Teague. "We're getting everything ready for tomorrow, but they'll want to chat before we get down to the real work. Won't you stay with us a little while, Teague?" He had intended to hide away from the women as soon as gentlemanly possible, as he had never been much for ladies chatting, and was even less inclined now that he would be required to focus on their words instead of letting his mind wander where his pills might take it. But the tone of Annalee's request said she noticed all the time he'd sidled out of their company, that her feelings would be hurt if he did so again. So even as he tried to hide the sigh he heaved at the approach of the 2 Everett women, he said, "Certainly." "Is there any news in town about the fighting in Pennsylvania?" Mrs. Warner asked as the group sat in the parlor while the oven was occupied for an hour with cake, and Teague remembered why he'd come to regret acting like a gentleman. "I know only what Harry knows, and that comes from what little the paper can gather from the telegraph," Mrs. Everett said. "The last we heard, there was still no end to it." "Oh, surely they're mistaken, Aunt Clara. 3 days?" Mrs. Dupree said. "Lord, watch over our Tom," Mrs. Warner murmured. Mrs. Everett closed her eyes for a moment and sighed. When she opened them again, she spoke to Teague. "Do you believe they will stop soon, Captain Scott?" "They must." 3 days. How many thousands of men lay putrefying on that battlefield after 3 days? How many millions of ants and maggots wriggled over their blackened faces and in through their wounds, gorging themselves? How many hundreds of men slipped in the blood as their regiments charged? How many were vomiting at this moment from that peculiar scent rotten flesh exudes in an almost suffocating invisible cloud? He held his breath and grimaced. He had smelled Gettysburg countless times before he heard of the town. Mrs. Everett was nodding at the answer he had given. God's will be done. Teague glanced over sharply at that, and then looked back down at his hand on the arm of his chair. It had been less than an hour since he had taken his pills, but he needed more now. That wonderfully dull feeling in his brain had left him. He would have to wait 3 more hours, or 2.5, for what harm could a few minutes do, before he could get that feeling back. He swallowed hard. Annalie, dear, haven't you finished your dress yet? Mrs. Warner asked after a silence. Yes, Mama, I just finished the last stitch. Annalie held the needle high above the fabric in her lap and reached for her scissors to cut the thread. Hold it up and let us see it. Teague swallowed again and raised himself from the chair as abruptly as was possible for him. Disappointed or not, Annalie would just have to abide without him. I beg your pardon, ladies. I'm loath to leave your company, but I need a little air. Please excuse me. He bowed slightly to them, and then left the room with Annalie standing with her dress held loosely in front of her. Thursday, 23rd September, 1858. I've been reviewing my days of the past few weeks and have only just realized that I neglected to write of my first meeting with Aubrey Hanlon. I'm a poor diarist indeed to have forgotten to write of that night, or else the rigors of study have so addled my appreciation of the comic that I could not be bothered to write of it. I shall correct the oversight now, for I think he and I will be fast friends, if he doesn't get me killed first. I had seen Aubrey before, being situated only a few doors down in the dormitory, and having attended several of the same lectures. I can imagine now what he would write about the dullness of our classes together in his frank manner. Classical rhetoric. Smacks of a Latin class to my mind. Professor must have consorted with Cicero himself, a regular greybeard. I already know enough Latin to last me a while. I suspect from his unguarded statements that he is a Catholic, though he goes to great pains to hide it. Geography of the European continent. Can't we get away from them yet? Suits me to know if you're in the middle of a country, you're probably in the capital, which is probably where you want to be anyhow. Natural philosophy. Nothing natural about it and too much philosophy. The class is among my favorites, so I anticipate lengthy disagreements regarding its worth. Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. 3 dead men asking too many questions for their own good, probably why they're dead. But I digress from my original purpose. We'd been at school only a few days when we first spoke. We were in the commissary for the evening meal, seated across from each other, and I was asking blessing over my food. During my prayer, I heard a sort of scraping of china against wood, but did not make the connection that it was the sound of my plate made upon a hasty removal, until I opened my eyes to stare at bare wood. I looked up to Aubrey, who stared back with an angelic face of innocence that I have since seen him feign in the presence of a beautiful woman, and then I nodded to James in his customary place with the other valets. James is a good boy, and seeing my plate on the floor behind Aubrey's chair, proceeded to step in the food and make the most sincere commotion of apologizing to the young master. He couldn't have left me a better opportunity if we had planned it all beforehand. While Aubrey was preoccupied with quieting James's den, I stole his plate from under him and set forth eating with great appetite. When finally Aubrey noticed his lack of food, he was set to pound the stuffing out of me, as he would sooner be hanged than be played for a fool by a ninny. I told him that was fine, that I would gladly accompany him outside the gate and lose some stuffing if I could finish eating first. A gentleman, despite his penchant for the coarse language acquired in a childhood spent in his father's shipyards, Aubrey consented not only to the delay, but also to both conversing with me about his background and waiting until I had deemed my meal properly on its way to digestion. At length I agreed to send James back to my rooms, and walked over to the gate with my boxing partner. On the way, Aubrey offered me a cigar, though I was quick to decline. Mother would have helped him beat me if ever I smoked. The length from the commissary to the gate being what it is, we decided to sit for a rest once we were off school grounds. Aubrey had a smoke. I watched the stars appear, and both of us became so restful that the moon was up when I shook Aubrey awake and suggested we postpone our bout. He felt it better to get the disagreement out of the way, but we both merely circled each other for a long while, any fight Aubrey had felt earlier having been diminished by time. I finally suggested getting in one hit apiece, and judging from the damage inflicted whom the winner should be. I split his lip, and he blacked my eye, giving him the undeniable victory, as my hurt was more visible and would last longer. We are as dissimilar as two men can be. He, a lackluster scholar given to cigar smoke and an occasional swallow of gin, and I, a student in danger of straining already weak eyes by reading every writer mentioned in the lectures. But for all our differences, we complement each other in temperament, and he is such a diversion from overstudy. He'll keep my head from floating away full of lofty esoteric thoughts that would otherwise threaten to drive out all practical earthly knowledge. We are set to attend the guest lecture together tomorrow evening, but I suspect we will slip out before it ends, and if Aubrey has his way, head over to one of the taverns he knows. If I've learned nothing else in the time I've known him, I've learned there is more than one way to gain an education. The first and most important lesson is how not to fall under the sway of wine, women, and song.